Welcome back to our sometimes meandering walks through the histories and the philosophies of music. Now, so far we've discussed equal temperament and Pythagorean tuning, so these should be quite familiar to you by now. Well, I'll put links to those videos in the description anyway. But what we didn't really discuss in those episodes was how, in a more practical sense, we came to decide what actual starting pitch to tune these scales from. So today we'll be taking a look at those reference pitches. Now, to get the basics out of the way right away, if you're listening to this series, then it is likely that you will already know that traditionally in the West, composers have used the A note above middle C as a reference pitch to tune their instruments. Now today, in standard ensembles, the A reference tone is tuned to 440 Hz. That is, the note produced by a vibration at the speed of 440 cycles per second. And this tone is the starting point from which you can then tune all the other notes of the scale. Now, if you're listening to this series, then it is also likely that you will have come across discussions or videos online that claim that in the past our ancestors used to tune the A to a slightly lower reference tone, 432 Hz to be exact. Now this is quite a small difference. For the sake of clarity, this is a tone at 440 Hz. And this is a tone at 432 Hz. Proponents of this 432 Hz frequency make all kinds of claims about this number. Not only that your music will sound better if you tune it to this particular tone, but also that it is the correct pitch to which the A should be tuned. Sometimes because it was the frequency used by Pythagoras himself to tune his monochord, or because it was the tuning pitch used by Mozart or other great composers, or because it has any number of healing and spiritual properties, or even because it is the fundamental vibration of the mind or the universe itself. And beyond this, even all manner of conspiracy theories that really have no place here. Now, no writings of Pythagoras survive to this day, and even in the works of his followers, there is no mention of anything that resembles 432 Hz, which isn't too surprising considering that Hertz only exists as a unit of measurement from the 19th century onwards. In the ancient world, scales and notes were described in terms of lengths and sizes, which is not a very accurate way of transmitting information about specific pitches. In fact, Pythagoras' system did not define any specific pitches, but rather the ratios or numerical relationships between different pitches out of which the harmonies arose. The octave, the perfect fifth, the fourth, and so on. Those who imagine that they are paying homage to Pythagoras by tuning their scales with the A at 432 Hz are in effect worshipping at the feet of false idols. The frequency 432 Hz really has nothing to do with Pythagoras. It is essentially a modern invention. In fact, one of the main reasons why the Pythagorean tuning system ended up acquiring the central role that it did, not only in the study of music, but also of philosophy and theology, was precisely that it was not tied to any particular frequency. The numerical relationships of tones that were described produced the same harmonies no matter what tone you started from, just like the formula for a triangle works for triangles of all sizes. We might call this pure form. And so this led Pythagoras and his followers to conclude that this pure form, this structure which held true at all frequencies, must in some sense be something that exists itself, beyond any of the specific cases. And so they envisaged a plane of existence that was beyond our space and time, a transcendent world of pure form. And this idea would end up having what may be the single greatest impact on the history of what is often referred to as Western thought. And we will be looking at this in greater depth in a future episode. Now, this Pythagorean worship of pure form would also end up developing its own set of problems. Ultimately, it seems, whether we worship at the feet of false idols or at the feet of great wisdom, what we find ourselves worshipping in the end is simply our own ideas. Now, as far as the claims that 432 Hertz is the fundamental vibration of the universe or anything like that, these are in that unfortunate territory of appropriating and misinterpreting terms and concepts from science and also from ancient wisdom traditions, and redefining them so vaguely that they can mean almost anything, and so often they end up meaning nothing at all. Which is unfortunate because, in fact, this general conceptual vagueness is almost the exact opposite of what we find when we actually go and read the writings of ancient philosophers and scholars and mystics. These were people who, by virtue of the very nature of the things they discussed, were often in the business of talking about things which are beyond words, and so they had to resort to allusion and metaphor and allegory. And yet, precisely because they knew how difficult it is to communicate certain things, they are hardly ever vague. Though they may sometimes appear obscure at first, careful reading reveals that their choice of words is almost always very deliberate and precise. Go read the Tao Te Ching if you want one of the greatest examples of this. So why am I bringing this whole 432 Hertz issue up? I'm not really someone who has much interest in bringing things up just to say they're wrong or debunk them or cast them aside. But simply put, because of the kinds of things I discuss in these videos, I have been asked by a few people who doubtless have stumbled upon some of these discussions online to give them some clarity on the whole issue. Now, I won't be going through all the various claims one by one to highlight what inaccuracies might be. There's actually a fairly good and mercifully brief article that goes through all the various claims, so I'll just provide a link to that. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is because when you look underneath all of the layers, there is a very small kernel of truth to this myth, and that is that there were times in the past when we used to tune our instruments to reference pitches that were lower than the current 440 Hz standard. However, these would have been lower even than 432 Hz. A good estimate for the pitch that Mozart would have tuned the A on his fortepiano, for example, is probably somewhere around about 420 Hz, and we'll get into this in a moment. In fact, in the 18th century in general, this is a period when we find some of the lowest tunings on record, and tunings have gradually been rising ever since, all the way up to the current 440 Hz standard. So I thought it might be handy to give you a little history of how these reference pitches evolved and were standardized that will hopefully clear up a few misconceptions along the way, so that we can get some of these things out of the way before we dive into much deeper esoteric waters in coming episodes. Now, when we try and understand the history of how past musicians would have tuned their instruments, we have two main sources that can guide our study. We have the writings of scholars and musicians who lived at the time, and we have surviving artifacts that we know can give us a somewhat accurate record of reference pitches that were used at the time. The two most important are tuning forks and organ pipes, as both tend to maintain their tuning relatively well over time. However, the tuning fork wasn't invented until 1711, and organ pipes, of which we do have some which survive dating back many centuries, have one significant problem. In the past, organ pipes were generally tuned by hammering the end of the pipe inwards into a cone-like shape or outward into a flare shape to alter the pitch. Now, the biggest organs in Europe have more than 10,000 pipes, so you can imagine how laborious a process this was. And for any long-serving organ, decades and even centuries of continuous reshaping gradually damaged the ends of the pipes, leaving them cracked and frayed. And this meant that from time to time, the ends would have to be trimmed, which would raise their overall pitch. So any pipes that survive to this day would have been tuned to a number of different frequencies over their lifetime. In fact, the time when our knowledge of past reference pitches really starts to come into focus is around about the advent of the 17th century, between the end of the 1500s and the beginning of the 1600s, which coincidentally is around about the time we ended our last video when we were looking at the musicology of Ming-era China. So it seems like quite a good place to pick up our story again. Now, what we find when we look back over to Europe in this time is that not only were there multiple scales being used at the time, as it would be a couple of centuries at least before equal temperament would really come to dominate in a big way, but the pitch standards themselves would have varied quite dramatically from place to place. Even within the same town, the intonation of church music was often different from the tunings used by people as they played and sang their popular songs. Humans at the time did not possess the kind of technology that allowed to accurately and precisely measure or reproduce a given pitch at a specific frequency. So tunings would have really been all over the place. And in fact, musicians of popular traditions in the past would in some cases simply have tuned their instruments so that they best suited their own vocal range. The variations in tuning that we find across Europe at this time mean that one church's A might have in fact even been closer to another church's B or C. And as we look across time over the last few centuries, we also find that overall pitches have tended to drift upwards and downwards at different periods, with two quite significant large-scale upward trends in the tuning of instruments. The first one reaching its peak at around the turn of the 17th century, and the second one, well, we currently find ourselves at the tail end of that one. Now, we have to understand that the instruments used during the Renaissance had a much softer tone than contemporary instruments. They did not sound as loud or as bright, even as the acoustic instruments we have today, let alone the amplified or electronic instruments that we now have. In fact, to many modern listeners, these instruments would almost sound muffled or muted by our contemporary standards. This was due to limitations in the choice of materials and in the ways that the materials could be treated and assembled. However, because of this very particular sound that they have, many of these instruments do have a more intimate feel, which has a beauty all of its own. However, at the time, musicians and luthiers found that by tuning their instruments slightly higher, this produced a brighter, more brilliant tone. This is especially true in the case of string instruments, because the higher tension in the string produces a greater amplitude in the higher harmonics. And so, in their desire to stand out among rival musicians and rival luthiers, they started to tune their instruments higher and higher over the years as they competed to outdo each other, and pitches gradually started to rise. This phenomenon is known as pitch inflation. Until at the turn of the 17th century, the situation was starting to get a little out of hand. In the Syntagma Musicum, one of the foremost treatises on musicology of its age. Michael Praetorius writes about singers complaining of chronic pains in the throat as they strained to hit higher and higher notes, and lutists and violists who were constantly snapping strings because of the excessively high pitches to which the music was being tuned. Some reference tones from this period have been measured as high as 560 Hz, and this is corroborated by writings of the time, meaning that in some places music was being performed anywhere up to a major third above the current 440 Hz standard. So a C would have sounded closer to an E on a modern piano. Now, to deal with this problem, local standards started to come into practice around Europe, and in some cases, even the establishment of separate tuning standards for different kinds of music. Churches in particular started tuning to lower frequencies due to the central role of the choir, so as to alleviate the stress that was put on singers. Overall, in the century or so following Praetorius, between the 17th and the 18th century, there was a general downward trend in tuning, although again this would have varied from place to place, and there would have been many different standards. And so, in the 18th century, we find tuning forks used to tune a reference A, which is lower than our current standard. For example, we have a surviving tuning fork, which was likely used by Handel, which produces a tone at 422.5 Hz, so a little over 18 Hz under the current standard. And a tuning fork that was owned by Johann Andreas Stein, which is measured to produce a tone at 421.6 Hz. Now, the reason why this tuning fork is of great interest to historians of music is that Stein was one of the greatest makers of keyboard instruments of his day, and he was largely responsible for the development of the Viennese fortepiano, which was a precursor to the modern piano. And this instrument was used by Haydn, by Mozart, and even by Beethoven in the earlier part of his career. So their instruments would also probably have been tuned to somewhere around this pitch. However, these lower pitches wouldn't end up lasting very long. During the classical and romantic periods, the emphasis in large-scale works shifted from sacred music, which had been dominated to a large extent by vocal music, towards secular music and instrumental music. And so this came with a second trend towards tuning instruments increasingly higher in pitch again. Orchestras and soloists were once again trying to achieve brighter tones, which the audiences absolutely loved. And audiences' tastes became ever more important as music moved from the churches to the newly opened concert halls and opera houses. In fact, the whole phenomena of pitch inflation can be understood to a certain extent as being somewhat analogous to the trend that occurred in rock music from its inception in the 60s, with bands constantly trying to achieve harder and heavier sounds by increasing distortion and volumes, and each trying to outdo the other, and audiences flocking to see bands with newer and heavier and bigger sounds. And the great classical and romantic soloists were the rock stars of their day. In a performance by Liszt or Paganini, there would have been a few softer, slow numbers that would have got everyone emotional, but the main meat of the show would have been a lot of hard and fast playing, a lot of improvising and riffing and entertaining, a lot of virtuosity, a lot of bravura, a lot of showing off, basically. And the crowds wouldn't just sit there in silence, as is often the case now. They could get pretty wild. These events would have been very different from our modern idea of classical concerts. And there are cases, even into the beginning of the 20th century, of extreme virtuosos such as Leo Ornstein, where crowds would be literally packed into concert rooms, with audiences even climbing up to windows to peer in from the streets or up telegraph poles and lampposts. And when you hear the sheer marvellous insanity of the pieces that Ornstein would have been playing at the time, these must have been absolutely crazy events to be a part of. This was during a brief but intense explosion of what is sometimes referred to as the American Futurism, which only lasted a few years and centres largely around the figure of Ornstein himself. Now, Leo Ornstein is, to a certain extent, a somewhat overlooked figure in the history of music, and this is in part down to his own choice. He almost completely removed himself from performing during his 20s, and he actually lived to be, I believe, 106, and lived into the early 2000s. If you want to get a sense of the music that he would have performed at these early concerts, then you should probably look up Wild Men's Dance, which you can find many versions of on YouTube. But if you want to get a sense of his more mature style once he retreated to a much more private life, then check out Morning in the Woods, which is almost like a synthesis of Scriabin and Debussy's musical styles. Anyway, returning to the 19th century, as reference tones were once again on the rise, there also came for the first time attempts to standardize concert pitch, both nationally and internationally. In part, this was to try to avoid pitch inflation once again getting out of hand, and in part, this was simply because with the rise of modernity and mechanization, there came a certain mania to standardize absolutely everything. As we will see, a lot of the standards proposed at this time tend to fall somewhere between 430 and 440 Hz. This was basically seen as a compromise between the pitches around 420 Hz, which were more optimal for singers, and the higher pitches that audiences were now used to and wouldn't have been happy with going all the way back down so low. For example, the French government in the mid-1800s proposed a standard of 435 Hz. The Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi, or Verdi, as some of my English friends like to call him, proposed a standard of 432 Hz, interestingly enough. This, by the way, is the only verified historical instance of someone proposing a 432 reference tone that I have come across. And before anyone gets too excited, it's probably worth pointing out that Verdi actually used a whole number of different reference pitches throughout his life. He was a prolific composer of vocal music, and as such, he was acutely aware of the problems posed by pitch inflation. And this was actually just one among a handful that he proposed. And there was also a slightly more unusual standard proposed at the time, which was known as philosophical or scientific pitch, which tuned not the A, but the middle C to 256 Hz, meaning that the A above would have been tuned to 430.5 Hz, so again, roughly within the same sort of bracket. Now, for those of you who know your way around numbers and who have an understanding of harmonic ratios and tunings, you will probably have already spotted what is interesting about this tuning. Now, 256 is a power of 2, and as you go up by powers of 2, then the number doubles each time. Now, with octaves, as you go up each octave, the frequency of the vibration also doubles each time. So the C above 256 would have been tuned to 512, and the one above that to 1024. Now going down from 256, the C below would have been tuned to 128, and below that to 64. And so you can see that this way all of the C notes are going to be tuned to powers of 2, which is quite handy for calculations. In fact, this reference tuning is still used, not among musicians, but in the scientific and specifically medical community. Tuning forks tuned to powers of 2 are used to test patients' hearing or to isolate and locate certain fractures. In fact, the cover image for this episode is actually a set of tuning forks from a medical catalogue. You might just be able to make out on each one of them the letter C followed by a number which is a power of 2, which designates the number of hertz. Now, when trying to standardize reference tuning during the 19th century, matters were further complicated by the fact that tuning can be significantly affected by atmospheric conditions, especially temperature and humidity. So, for example, the French standard of 435 Hz had been defined at a temperature of 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So, in Britain, the Royal Philharmonic Society reasoned that at a slightly more comfortable room temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the reference pitch should be 439 Hz. Now, the math by which they figured this out was very dubious, to say the least. In fact, the effect of temperature on pitch cannot really be described in a linear function of any kind. It's a chaotic phenomenon that depends on a huge number of factors, including materials and the size of the instrument and so on. However, dubiously derived or not, larger orchestras in metropolitan areas around Britain were quick to adopt the Philharmonic 439 Hz standard around the turn of the 20th century, although for many decades smaller ensembles in rural areas did actually continue to use an older standard of 452 Hz. Ultimately, even this 439 Hz standard was superseded by a very close rival reference tone, the Stuttgart pitch, which was so called because it was initially introduced at the Stuttgart Conference of 1834. And this was a reference A tuned to 440 Hz. Now, this was preferred to the 439 standard simply because 440 is much more easily divisible. 439 is a prime number, and so this made 440 more practical to calculate with. This standard was popular in the United States during the early 20th century, and in 1939 the British Standards Institute also backed the 440 standard. And so it went on to be adopted by the ISO in 1955, and it's been the most widely used international standard of the last few decades. Now, this is not the end of the story. Pitch inflation continues still today, even if at a much slower rate, and many orchestras in continental Europe and other areas of the world actually still tune to slightly higher reference tones, around about 442 or 443 Hz. And it's not uncommon to still find soloists who will tune slightly up by a few cents compared to the other musicians they're playing with, ever so slightly, so they don't sound out of tune, but it just gets that slightly brighter tone. Again, still looking to get that slight edge. Certain instrument makers and piano manufacturers also tune their instruments just above the 440 Hz standard, so as to help the instrument stand out a little and produce a more brilliant tone. In fact, there is not a single 440 Hz standard. Even now there are many standards, and they slowly drift and shift and creep, and even the nominal 440 Hz standard may change again in the future. As is often the case, once we look into things, we find that they're never quite as simplistic or clear-cut as we might imagine them to be. The standard, whether it be 440, 432, or any other arbitrary number you can think of, is really just an idea, an attempt to pin down a shifting reality. But in the end, the flux, the continuous drift and change, is the reality, an observable reality. Trying to trace the tunings used in Europe back even just a few centuries, as we have seen, becomes very quickly an extremely imperfect science, and in all periods we find a huge variety of different scales and intonations and tuning standards in use. So hopefully this should give you some idea of why we have no idea what frequency Pythagoras would have used as his reference tone, if he even had a reference tone. And also hopefully you can imagine how messy the reality of reference tones would have been in the past. And in fact, this was precisely the problem that the Chinese came up against when trying to define the pitch of the Huangzong tone, as we saw in the last episode. Imagine, for example, that I cut a reference bamboo pipe, and we decide that this will be our baseline unit of measurement. The next thing we do is to cut a second pipe, so that it matches the first, and the two sound in unison. Now we take this second pipe to a distant town, so that we might produce a third reference pipe there. But now we run into a problem. By the time we have got there, the second pipe will not produce quite the same note as it did on the first day. The atmospheric conditions are different, the wood has aged slightly, and in fact even just the way that it is blown will slightly affect the pitch anyway. In fact, the more time passes, the further the tone will drift from the day that it was cut. So we might decide to take the third pipe back to where the first pipe is held and measure it against that one. But here we encounter the same problem. That pipe too produces a slightly different pitch from when it was originally cut. And in fact, all of these reference pipes are simply slowly and imperceptibly drifting. None of them are fixed in time. Ancient tuning systems, like the Pythagorean, tended to be ratio-based, as these can easily be calculated from subdivisions of a string, independent of what note that string is initially tuned to. And even when we find discussions of reference tones in ancient literature, they're generally not documented in a way that allows us to accurately reproduce them. In fact, our ability to reproduce ancient music in any meaningful way by interpreting surviving documents and scores really dates back only about 1200 years into the past, to the compositions of a 9th century Byzantine abbess known as Cassiani, or Cassia, who was not only a great composer and poetess, but also an important religious and political figure of her age. And even with these compositions, many aspects of the interpretations are disputed. Music's older than this period, though we find tantalizing glimpses of them in ancient documents, are beyond our reach and echo away into the mists of time. And this barely takes us half of the way back to the days of Pythagoras. And we have to remember to not get too hung up on what specific pitches Pythagoras or anyone else might have used, even if we could know. The Pythagorean ratios themselves were largely used in the ancient world in philosophical and theological investigations, and don't necessarily correspond to the specific tunings used by actual musicians in the popular musical traditions of the day. The reality of performed music in the ancient world would have been much richer and more varied than just a single tuning system. Most ancient musicians did not know nor care who Pythagoras was, and tunings would have varied not only between cultures, but even within cultures. In fact, this is what we found when we looked at the history of reference tones over the last few hundred years. There was not a single A tuned to one frequency, but 1,000 different A's, all slightly different. And we find something similar today when we look at the rich tapestry of traditional musics performed around the world. One of the most striking examples of this is the Indonesian gamelan, native to the islands of Java and Bali. This is a musical tradition that is not only extremely highly sophisticated in terms of its rhythmical complexity, their tuning system is of a subtlety and richness that is far beyond the conventions of standard Western musical systems. Now, there are two root scales, or basic subdivisions of the octave, known as slendro and pelog, from which the musicians of the gamelan derive the pitches to construct the scales to which they tune their instruments. However, each gamelan, each ensemble, tunes the pitches of their scales slightly differently. And actually, sometimes these variations in pitch can be quite dramatic too, to the point that I believe it was the Canadian musicologist Colin McPhee who said that in Indonesia there are as many different scales as there are gamelan, which to a certain extent was slightly over-enthusiastic exaggeration on his part, and it ignores the fact that there are musicians in Indonesia who do use more universal scales that allow musicians from different areas to play together. But you get the general point. And not only does each ensemble tune their scales slightly differently from place to place, the gamelan has another feature when it comes to tuning, which is possibly the most unusual aspect of Indonesian music. The instruments in a gamelan occur in pairs, and each of the instruments in a pair is tuned slightly apart from the other. You might say that they're slightly out of tune with one another, but this would be an incorrect term because you can only be out of tune relative to the correct pitch that you're meant to be tuned to. And the two instruments in a gamelan pair are meant to be tuned slightly apart in this way. In each pair, the slightly higher sounding instrument is known as the inhale, and the slightly lower is known as the exhale. And the two are tuned apart by such a small interval that when they are played in unison, the ear doesn't hear two distinct pitches, rather the inhale and the exhale combine to produce a resonant pulsation or vibration that runs through the resulting tone. This pulsating effect, which gives gamelan music a certain shimmering, suspended quality, is the result of the interference patterns that occur in the harmonics due to the phase shift of these two slightly deviating tones, and known as interference beats. And in fact, by tuning the pairs slightly closer together or slightly further apart, you can alter the speed of this vibration. And this is precisely what each ensemble does. The minute interval between the inhale and the exhale is also tuned slightly differently from ensemble to ensemble, so that each has a constant resonant vibration that flows through all the notes, which occurs at a speed which is particular to that ensemble. In fact, by way of such distinguishing features in the tuning, and by the style and manner of the pieces played, those who know what to listen for can often tell which area of Java or Bali an ensemble is from, in a similar way to how you might be able to tell where someone is from by their regional accent or the dialect when they speak. And in fact, the example of spoken language is a very apt one, because pitch standards like 440 Hz, or even 432 if it was a pitch standard, or the scales as they are defined by their mathematical ratios in books on music theory, are to music what dictionaries and books on grammar are to language. Now, a dictionary and a grammar book can be useful guides for learning a language, but when you actually then walk the streets, you find that nobody really talks like that. People pronounce words in 100 different ways, and they structure their sentences in ways that no grammarian could imagine. They play around with words and invent new ones every day. They talk and write in ways that the textbook would tell you is wrong. But ultimately it is the textbook that has to be updated and changed, and that is shown to be wrong. Because the textbook is an approximation, a simplified model. Language is what springs forth from the mouths of humans every day. And as in the case of the reference tone, language, as it is depicted in the textbook, is simply an idea, to a certain extent an illusion, a projection of the mind. The flux, the continuous drift and change of language, is the reality, an observable reality. And when we stop to consider it carefully, we find that this continuous shifting or flowing is in fact the only reality we encounter when we simply perceive things as they manifest, rather than seeing them as our mind reimagines them. Our mind imagines the world very differently from how our senses perceive it. It crystallizes the fluid reality of perception into simple, fixed concepts. And we have a tendency to get very hung up on these. I don't think you need me to tell you how far people can go in fighting over ideas and symbols born in the human mind. And you see this kind of thinking at all scales. Even at a very small, mundane scale, you find people arguing over the correct use of grammatical structures and words. Or in music, you find people arguing over whose favourite genre is best, or over Pythagorean tuning and equal temperament, or over 440 Hz versus 432 Hz, as if any of these were anything more than just some idea that someone came up with, and as if they were some ultimate fixed truth rather than just the chance contingencies emerging out of a never-ending shifting. Our intellect simplifies and systematizes the quickly changing world we perceive via the senses down into abstract models that are more similar to itself. And it imagines these ideas to be truths more real than the truths perceived by the senses. That we can do this is both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. We imagine perfect geometries and entities which are unchanging over time, and in fact we even try to make these manifest in the world in the form of many of the things that we make and build, and in particular in the form of our units of measurement. A perfect, ideal unit of measurement is an object or structure that will be exactly the same tomorrow as it is today and as it was yesterday. In other words, it stands in defiance of time itself, which makes all things impermanent and subject to change. Human intellect has strained over the millennia to create just such an eternal artifact. We have developed the most sophisticated material sciences in trying to create units of measurement that won't degrade or get damaged over time, and then sealed them away in chambers where they are very rarely even seen, let alone disturbed. We have created hermetically sealed environments, so protected from the changes going on beyond their confines, so static that within them it is almost as if time did not pass. For many units of measurement, we have even transcended the use of a physical master unit altogether in our ever-changing quest to find or create something that is unchanging over time. Time itself is measured by means of the acoustic vibrations produced by the isotope cesium-133, and the meter is defined by means of the speed of light, all measured by machines of mind-numbing precision. Civilizations have dedicated huge resources to pursuing these goals, because by the use of such standards, humans have established, and more often brutally imposed, law and structure in their dealings. After all, the very idea of law and justice implies the ability to measure and compare different instances. It's not a coincidence that the blindfolded figure of justice holds in one hand a sword, and in the other a set of scales. The ability to measure, coupled with the military might to enforce this. Power has generally been held by those who could impose relatively stable systems of measurement necessary for the production of goods, and very relatively stable currencies for trading these goods at the marketplace. And with each new regime, declarations were always made in the forms of rituals and ceremonies that the laws that it enforced, and even more the measurements and ideals that underpinned them, were eternal truths, even though the reality was that they were as unstable and changing as the regimes that backed them. At the end of the day, these declarations were always, and still are, acts of magic, both in the modern, more simple sense of just being make-believe, but also in the more profound sense of manipulating conventional reality by means of the use of symbols and ideas. And in fact, here we still are, irrevocably in time. And silently time continues its work of eroding and reshaping. In a quiet suburb of Paris, there is a chateau with an underground vault, locked with 3 independently controlled keys, which are themselves kept in different locations around the world. Inside the vault is an environmentally monitored safe, and in this there are 3 glass domes, one inside the other. Under the third and final dome sits one of the most hallowed artifacts of the modern age. It is a small cylinder of precisely equal height and diameter, made of a platinum iridium alloy, the international prototype kilo, the master kilo itself, known affectionately as the Big K. And all units of mass are defined by this one object. It is one of the most precise and closely guarded artifacts ever produced by humanity. And the safe itself is left untouched for years at a time. And even on the rare occasions when it is opened, it is often only just to see that the IPK is still there. For those inspections, not even the most outer of the glass domes is touched. And yet despite all this precaution, it is slowly, almost imperceptibly fading away. It is estimated to lose roughly 1/20,000,000th of a gram every year. Estimated because when your unit of measurement itself is shifting, it's very hard to know by how much. It can only be measured relative to clones that are dotted around the world, and these, if anything, are degrading even quicker because they are used more frequently. And the near-perfect vacuums, the hyperbaric chambers, the hermetically sealed environments in which we perform the precise measurements by which we define measurement itself, not to mention the sophisticated instruments we use to perform them, themselves require huge concentrations of energy, the eternal fire, not only to make them, but also to maintain them. All of these systems are so precise that they can barely exist, as the slightest disturbance would make them utterly useless, and so they have to be sealed away and protected, and hardly ever seen, lest coming into the slightest contact with the real world contaminate them. And such precise and delicate systems can only be sustained while the civilizations that produce them continue to exist. And civilizations come and go. They emerge like a froth on the crest of a wave and vanish into memory just as quickly. And ours is no different. And ultimately, entire species are swallowed up by the passage of time. And when ours vanishes too, so will all those artifacts and artifices by means of which we believed for a flickering moment that we might touch eternity. Heraclitus, the philosopher known to the ancients as the obscure, famously put into words, Panther Gray, everything flows, everything is in motion. Around about the same period, several thousand miles away, over in India, a slightly oblique interpretation of the opening of Gautama Buddha's fire sermon to the Bhikkhus monks points to a similar truth. Sabbam bhikkhave adittam. All is burning. Among the Greek gods, Zeus, being the ruler of the gods, represented law and intellect. And we see in him an image of the human attempt to overcome time. By means of a subterfuge, he managed to escape being devoured by his father Kronos, who is time, and who ate all his own children, because all that is born in time must also be consumed and die within time. The wife of Kronos, Rhea, the mother of the gods, hated him for devouring their children, and so she devised a plan to trick her husband. When she gave birth to her son Zeus, she hid him in Crete, and instead gave her husband a stone wrapped in a blanket, which Kronos, being so voracious, devoured instantly without realizing the ruse. And so, by means of cunning and intelligence, time itself was tricked. And when Zeus grew up, he returned to overthrow his father and imprisoned him in Tartarus, a timeless void which had existed before even Kronos himself. And so it was that intellect subdued and defeated time. But the Greeks must have intuited that it wasn't quite that simple, because Zeus, being a child of time, still had to live in time, and so did the world of humans over which he ruled. And in the stories that we are told about him, he is often a melancholy and capricious and frustrated figure. In trying to reject time, he was ultimately rejecting his own nature. And for a world within time, salvation is not to be found by trying to escape from its own temporal nature. Just as a child may sometimes not always like those aspects of themselves which they have inherited from their parents, but they will also not find happiness by trying to run from who they are. And ultimately, Zeus found himself to be the ruler of a world in which he could do almost anything he wanted. And so he did, without ever wondering, it would seem, why he did what he did, and why he desired the things that he desired. He could do whatever he wanted, but he was a slave to those wants and desires. He was a lawgiver who often behaved like a petty and capricious ruler, and he got his way most of the time, and yet when he got what he wanted, it gave him very little satisfaction, because his incessant quest to fulfill his never-ending desires was nothing more than the blind and aimless wandering of a broken heart. The aimless wandering of a mind that may understand all things, but not itself. And intellect always imagines that it might escape from time into the eternal, but that eternal that it has its gaze fixed on is also always changing, because it is nothing but a projection of that intellect, which remains transfixed, gazing at its own shadow. And that very unfolding of intellect by which it dreams its dreams of eternity is itself a process which must necessarily occur within time. But now we're really starting to get way ahead of ourselves, so we'll have to leave that story there for now. We do have an entire future episode lined up, which will be dedicated to looking at the syncretism of music and time, and also other episodes where we'll doubtless be picking up some of these threads again. I must confess that the nominal subject matter of this episode, the history of the tuning of the specific 440 Hz standard, is, to me at least, definitely not the most interesting of the topics we're covering. It's the sort of fairly straightforward chronology that you can get from any book on the history of music. You don't really need to come to my kind of content for that sort of thing, but it needed to be addressed, at least to clear up some of the possible misconceptions before we get too far into some of our topics. So I kind of gave myself permission to go down any tangents I felt like along the way in this episode to keep myself entertained, and hopefully you guys too. Although I think that the result is that this is going to end up being twice as long as many of the other episodes. But we have actually covered a lot of ground in this episode, and ground that gives us good footing for future topics, and that gets a number of things out of the way, which hopefully means that future episodes will be a bit shorter and more focused. So, to wrap things up for this episode, because this one's turning out to be pretty long. Now, over the last few videos, we've been looking at different systematized forms of tuning, and the various numerical models that were devised around them. And these models have served as a useful tool and as a guide in the development of many beautiful and rich musical traditions, and also to us as a useful guide in these episodes in which we have started to explore some of the musical realities of the world. But inevitably, what often ends up happening when these systems are developed and put into place is that some people always get a little too obsessed with the numbers themselves and with the classifications and the schemas that the mind projects onto the world. Numbers can be useful guides, but it would be very foolish to use numbers to decide, for example, what is good and bad music, and let numbers get in the way of our ears. And unfortunately, this is often what happens when people start saying that this way of tuning or this other is better than other ways of tuning, just because of something they have read or something that they think they know that others don't. It is often the case that people put great pride in their intellect and in their learning and in their likes and dislikes and in the opinions that they have. And by these, they often limit themselves, putting the mind before the body. This is a trap that we all fall into quite often and quite easily if we are truly honest with ourselves. And when we do, in many cases, the only cure is to learn to practice long periods of silence, first with the mouth, but most importantly, within the mind. And this is nothing new. Almost 2,400 years ago in China, we find Zhuangzi writing this about the courtesans and intellectuals he saw, who were so proud of the symbols of their status, and too enamored with their own ideas and learning to understand anything beyond them. If what you have gotten has gotten you into trouble, then can you really be said to have gotten something? If so, then the pigeons and doves in their cage have also gotten hold of something. With likes and dislikes, sounds and colours, you cripple what is on the inside. With leather caps and snipe-feathered bonnets, batons stuck in belts and sashes trailing, you cramp what is on the outside. The inside hemmed in by pickets and pegs, the outside heaped in wraps and swathes, and still you stand in this tangle of wraps and swathes and declare that you have gotten hold of something. If so, then the condemned men with their chained wrists and manacled fingers, the tiger and the leopard in their pens, have also gotten hold of something. This is from the Burton Watson translation of the Zhuangzi. And you might remember that in the last episode we mentioned another Chinese text composed around about the 2nd century BC, which is also deeply infused with ideas of the Tao, the Huainanzi. And in it we found a discussion of the fundamental resonance of reality, which is described through the metaphor of music. But unlike the narrow idea proposed by the 432 Hz crowd, that this fundamental resonance might be a single specific frequency, what we are told is that this is a vibration so deep and so mysterious that it encompasses all frequencies, that it does not simply cause a single note or a single string on the lute to vibrate in resonance with it, but that it causes all the strings of the lute to vibrate. In fact, it is in consonance with everything, because it is the vibration of all the world, and the vibration that causes all things to move, and causing them to move, it causes them to be. It is both the mover and the movement of all things. It has infinite manifestations that are always changing, and it is one. Now this to me seems a much better image for the world, and for the sounds of the world, than the idea of a single supreme frequency that excludes all others, which is after all just a mirror for the simple idea of a single supreme truth that excludes all others. When we remain in silence and simply observe the world as it is, we find again a continuous flux, at once both infinitely simpler and infinitely more complex than the artificial truths of the human mind. In logic, A always equals A, but in the world, A is never quite the same as it was even just a fraction of a moment ago. Everything flows, and all is burning. The number of different tunings that humans have used over the millennia when creating music is beyond counting, and they have created and found beauty in each. And this is an undisputable reality about the world. And it is good to remember this when someone tells us that there is one correct way of tuning, to exclusion of all others. There is literally an entire world of sound out there. All you have to do is listen. For my part, these days, when I work with sound, I must confess I very rarely use scales or tunings as a reference anymore. You could say that I use an artisan's approach to sound. A good artisan is guided by his hands, and I am guided by my ears. The techniques that I've learnt from different musics and from sound engineering are all still there, but they're simply an implicit, subconscious component of the process. The tones are allowed to drift freely, splintering off into a myriad of microtonal interactions, and the sounds occur in scattered, rippling patterns. This is a world of sounds that is, in a way, closer to the realities we find when we turn outward towards the world, rather than inward towards the mind. So to round this episode off, I thought I might play you a short clip from a longer piece, The Emptiness of Sound, which I created for radio last year, just to give you an idea of what the results of such an approach might be. Naturally, the possibilities are endless, and this is just one of the many directions that can be explored. I might end up uploading the whole piece to YouTube anyway at some point, so if I do, I'll just add a link to the description along with a few other similar pieces. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for bearing with me through this slightly more rambling episode, and I'll see you next time.
sounds you are hearing are all coming out of silence. You don't see any reason for them to begin. They just appear, and then they echo away through the corridors of the mind which we call memory.
Suddenly I'm falling